Hello everyone, Anomaly here, and welcome to a little bit of a talking head video. I think I've done one of these ever, but I wanted to sort of get in front of the camera, talk a little bit about some of the PTR announcements that came in this week from Blizzard. So today, we'll be going through some of those announcements. So Blizzard earlier this week put out a huge blue post, I'll link it in the description below, about the 9.0.5 PTR, which is coming sometime in March. And they sort of laid out some of the major things they're looking at. And today we're sort of gonna just talk through some of them. Um, so they posted this large post here, as you can see, but we'll sort of jump right into some of the more gory details that everyone is potentially aware of. If you're not, there's a bunch of write-ups everywhere, but at least I'll give you some of my thoughts on some of the major points here that they made and things that they're looking at. So the first up is upgradable Mythic Keystone Gear. Essentially, we're going back to Valor Points, or really Valor Points Lite. So basically what they've done is they've reviewed sort of a lot of the feedback around the gearing. I've talked on the Peak of Serenity podcast a little bit about the gearing process today. A lot of it is, do a bunch of PvP, get rating, get currency there, upgrade those gears, purchase that gear, and sort of fill in holes that you're not going to get or that you have from a rating environment. I mean, I can look at some of the raiders in my guild, particularly the ones that have focused on PvP. They're fully geared out, but I mean, the large majority of their gear is from Mythic or from PvP. So right now, Mythic Plus from a gearing perspective just isn't there. And even raids, which we'll talk about probably towards the end of this, also a little bit lax. So basically what they're doing is they are bringing back Valor gear, or Valor as a currency, and they're allowing you to upgrade Mythic Plus gear that drops with Valor to various item levels. And they sort of address the framework, the overall framework here of the system, which essentially is complete every dungeon on a 5 or higher, and you'll be able to upgrade those items, your Mythic Plus items, to level 200. Complete all of the dungeons at plus 10 or higher. You can then move that up to the cap to 213. And finally, get Keystone Master, or do every dungeon timed at a plus 15 level, will allow you to upgrade your gear to 220. Cool. They made the system somehow, I don't want to say worse because you can upgrade it, but they made it awful, right? So I think the biggest thing here, right, is that there are two components to the Valor upgrade system, right? Number one, it's just upgrades. So you still need to run these dungeons, potentially maybe not at an appropriate level, right? You could spam out, I guess, plus 2s, right? But you still need to run these dungeons and get drops from these dungeons. So targeting a specific set of loot, right, or a specific item that you want, you essentially have to focus in on that dungeon and complete it as many times as you want until you get that item. And then once you do get that item, then you can upgrade it. But you're not gaining anything by going through the process of actually grinding out the item, right? Because the requirement for upgrading to at least 220, requires you to run every dungeon at a certain keystone level, right? You sort of have to balance out what you're focusing on, which is a little bit of a contrast, or really a stark contrast to PvP, which is essentially like PvP's gate is a centralized rating, right? You can focus on, one of 3 or 4 different activities, whether you're into 2s, 3s, or, RBGs, rated battlegrounds. But each one of those activities sort of raises currency that you can use to do upgrades or purchase base items, or, you can raise that rating up, and it doesn't matter, what your RBG rating is, you still get to upgrade all your gear. So once you hit 1800, say in RBGs, it's not like you can upgrade everything but your helm slot and your boot slot, right? They don't tie certain ratings for certain activities behind anything, right? Your upgrades are sort of a flat, whatever your highest rating is in PvP, you can upgrade that item. Here with Mythic Plus, right, you don't get that option of purchasing a specific item. You have to run every dungeon to a certain level. So then you unlock the ability to upgrade. And then on top of that, you also have to target a specific dungeon to get the item you want, right? With PvP, you basically say, hey, I ran the raid this week, got a couple 226 pieces, but my helm still, I level 213, so I will buy a helm, upgrade it, with honor and conquest, to 226, and then I fill in that slot directly. With this system, you would have to basically get all your 15 keys done, still have a helm slot, and then basically look, all right, what dungeon drops a helm? If it's mists for me, well, I get to sit, the next week in mists, right? in sort of trying to upgrade that piece of gear. So definitely a large difference in terms of the systems. I think it's somehow worse. I think also lowering this to 220, puts Mythic Plus sort of on the back foot. Um, I don't know. People like to compare like difficulty in certain areas where like, oh, 2100 in PvP, is somehow, more difficult than, doing all 15s, timing all 15 keys versus killing Mythic Denathrius, right? I don't want to get in sort of that discussion about what's more difficult. I just think from a fairness perspective, right, you have varying levels of sort of ability to upgrade gear and I think doing all 15s is just not the way, right? Um from a feedback perspective, right? Like what I would potentially do to change this, and I think I've talked about this a little bit, which would be, make the gear like keystone dependent, right? So basically say like, look, if you want to upgrade this helm that drops in mists to the max item level, whatever that is, you just have to complete mists at a 15 level. And that way it unlocks all the gear that is directly from mists to be upgradable to that, that max item level, right? And do the same tiering. Like I find with the tiering, I think I talked about this is where, if you have to do a certain item level and need to upgrade it, complete the keystone at that level, don't just automatically unlock it. But I think coupling this with, Keystone Conqueror, Keystone Explorer, whatever the, Keystone Master, sort of, limits gearing, it sort of limits it even more. And it's not a system that I think people are going to want to interact with, understanding that, like, hey, to get 220 gear, I have to do every dungeon at 15, which means, like, if I don't get drops in the interim, like, my upgrades are sort of, you know, I don't get upgrades that way, right? I can't upgrade the gear unless I sort of, stop focusing on plus 15s. Like I guess the idea is you progress through it like 5 to 10s to 15s, but there's still large gaps, right? There's still a huge difference between a plus 12 and a plus 15, and um, in terms of difficulty and gear level. So system, not a huge fan of it. I think they could have done better. I would have liked something, like I said, where you can target a specific dungeon, still do the upgrades for it, right? But target one dungeon, right? And you can get a piece, and as long as you do that dungeon on a 15, you can upgrade it to like the max level. So I'm fine with the requirement of having to do 15s. I think it's implemented pretty broadly, and I think somehow worse, you know, because now we have a way to do it. It's just like, oh, I got to slog through 8 15s, and then if they add more dungeons, I got to do it again, and then to upgrade again, I got to, I don't, whatever. So yeah, more to come. I think this needs a lot of feedback. It's nice that they're bringing back a way to do the upgrades. I don't know if a vendor. I don't know. A lot of people were kind of clamoring for like a specific PvE vendor, right? I don't know if we need that, but I think it potentially would be. The other thing that they talked about a little bit was around Covenant and Legendary tuning. Essentially looking at the current Covenants. They released a couple of these, like I think the Warrior, Necro, Lord signature ability, or sorry, Covenant ability, received some buffs, right? And they also buffed Fleshcraft from a signature ability for Necro Lords too. And things like this, I don't know. I mean, I guess doing it in an interim patch like this is something to maybe make sense, but I mean, I would have rather have liked to see updates like this at the end of a tier, right, or with a large content patch, just because if you're not going to do frequent updates, doing sort of balance changes midstream, particularly if people are progressing or people are looking at always playing the best Covenant or playing the best legendaries, right? You've just sort of added a bunch of interim work that I think a lot of people, generally expect on like an actual point, dot one, dot two release versus a, you know, oh 05, oh 05 release. So, hey, I'm always a fan of more tuning, more changes. I think they need to look at the game and do this more often. But again, if we're now going to get, actually, to be fair, I'm actually doing this kind of live, but as I'm thinking about it, maybe this is kind of a good thing in terms of like they'll get to more frequent updates. I just think I think it's I think it just doesn't make it's not a very well thought out process in terms of my mind, in terms of like you probably need to do this more often. People would appreciate it more often. um and I think doing sort of updates like this sort of midstream, particularly with a rating tier or even like PvP season, just puts a bunch of extra burden on certain players. So all for these changes, I mean, the Necro Lord signature ability Fleshcraft is huge. Like it depending on how that lays out, I mean, you might just be Necro Lord just for the DR and the shield right now. But yeah, I think changes always good. I just think they need to probably look at this in more of a .1 release, or in a more like frequent, like monthly, fixes perspective. So, but in any event, we'll see how this plays out in terms of like the actual updates we get. Right now, as of February 10th, when I'm recording this, there are no Mistweaver specific updates. And other than I think some mana changes, nothing real major in terms of Mistweaver Paladin, which is what I primarily play. There were some spiritual nerfs, which I'm always a fan of, but it's still early, so we'll see how it all plays out at the end of the day. The only other final thing I wanted to quickly cover here was just this tweet coming from old, Daddy Ian, from old Ian, around raid gearing, right? So they sort of acknowledged this, in a recent interview also around the fact that PvP itemization and PvP gearing is very straightforward, very much the path of least resistance from a player perspective. So they did, address this in terms of raid gearing needs help. However, probably something that I don't know if I generally agree with this, but the idea is they don't want to touch raid gearing just yet in terms of a 0.05 release, right? Just because of, the other, I don't know, their solutions potentially complicate, they say, complicate things because raid loot tables are so static and small. So we'll see. I mean, it sounds like gearing in general from a PvE perspective, they're taking a look at. I mean, the Great Vault was supposed to sort of cover a lot of these holes, and I think it does a fairly good job. It's just now there is just less overall loot, and they may have sort of turned that knob way too down. And maybe they need to sort of swing it a little bit back, right? Like, Legion and BFA, we may have gotten too much loot. I think now it's sort of too little, and I don't even know if it's too little. It's just not impactful enough, right? Like I can spend 30, 45 minutes trying for a piece in Mythic Plus, or I can spend 30 or 35 minutes PvPing and potentially just say like, hey, I've made noticeable progress to my next gear upgrade. So, but yeah, more to come on this. Looks like they're looking at it, which is always a good thing when they acknowledge stuff like that. So in any event, I think that is it for me. So those are my thoughts. Ultimately, Valor, step in the right direction. I think this initial sort of structure is a little too restrictive. Maybe need to open it up a little bit. Maybe just look at some like interesting ways to allow you to target specific pieces while not also requiring you to do every dungeon to get an upgrade. But yeah, we'll see what changes they make as the PTR progresses. So, ultimately, hop on PTR, take a look at what they've got out there, submit your feedback. I'll be doing the same here. So, but other than that, thank you guys for listening, and we will talk to you guys later. Bye.